maybe looking a bit to the future now and talking a little about the nuclear landscape today. And I made a couple of comments on this at Russell and Greenpeace's event on the Rainbow Warrior last night. But I mean, nuclear weapons control in architecture is in some disarray. We have the intermediate range treaty, which very much applied to Europe, which both the US and Russia, I understand, have now abandoned. There's quite a major treaty, the New START one, between the US and Russia, which expires next year. That's not long to get a rollover in today's fraught geopolitics. We've got the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which doesn't achieve a lot and certainly has never seen the 5 acknowledged nuclear powers move towards complete general disarmament. We have other nuclear powers which have arisen, which don't subject themselves to the discipline, whether it's of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, whether it's the North Koreans, India, Pakistan, Israel, and then Iran, which does, off and on and to some degree, ends up having its nuclear sites bombed, which is highly risky. So, and we're in an era of AI, ask AI, please create me a dirty nuclear bomb from a small amount of fissile material, it'll probably tell you. These are scary times and there's new threats. So, Ken, you mentioned that, there's new things the governments could be doing. Where in this sort of rich field of pickings would you be recommending that the New Zealand government focus its attention?
Yeah, right. Well, I can come up with 3 ideas in that respect for the 2020s. You have to place it for the obvious, state the obvious. You have to place it in the context of current geopolitical strategic tension. And so the political probability theory of it getting through immediately may be low, which in my view does not mean, in fact, you can do a flip argument and say, therefore, you have to produce these ideas in times of tension, and then there's the moment of opportunity in political leadership somewhere. So I would suggest 3, and I would preface it by saying that the issue of keeping our nuclear-free policy alive requires, and you more or less mentioned this, requires the rigor of policy retention, because it's quite easy to do a lot of murmuring and modify the policy in substance while you are articulating a theoretical retention. And I think we've got to be careful about that. But my first suggestion is that I think the critical thing is the rejection of nuclear deterrence as a theory for your national defense, national security. And you and Sir Geoff Palmer and David Lange articulated that quite brilliantly in the 1980s. But I was always conscious that it was not an integral part of the 1987 legislation, which is focusing on non-deployment, non-possession, etc. And so it is simply a political policy, not legally embedded in New Zealand. So one could consider, and this is where you don't have to dialogue with the rest of the world, it's an internal dialogue. You could think about amending the 87 legislation to include a section in which we renounce nuclear deterrence for our defense. And that becomes a legislative, almost a part of constitution, certainly statutory law. That's one. Secondly, I think we need to, and this has been articulated already in this discussion, the need to determine whether AUKUS and New Zealand's potential involvement in certainly Pillar 2, but also, for that matter, Australia's involvement in Pillar 1, is a violation of, quote, the spirit of the Treaty of Rarotonga. Now, the Rarotonga is fairly unique in the sense that Chris Beebe was really insistent on getting the idea of violating the spirit of the Rarotonga Treaty. And I devoted some time to checking out what that might mean. There's only one book done by a former ICJ judge on the spirit of a treaty as opposed to the letter. And we don't have time to go into great detail about AUKUS, or at least I won't, others can. But I personally would be concluding that or both Australia's engagement in Pillar 1 violates the spirit of the Rarotonga Treaty, and New Zealand's potential engagement in Pillar 2 does the same. But the irony here is that yet another another aspect of the Rarotonga Treaty was that you can't withdraw from the treaty. You can only, other than the fact if somebody else has violated the treaty. And so if Australia can't withdraw from the Rarotonga Treaty, but its violation of the spirit through AUKUS could mean that other members of the Rarotonga Treaty could. So it's worth just exploring the legal and political implications of that. And then the third one, which is in some ways I think it's interrelated. I think it's the critical one. It's New Zealand, which played a major role in the TPNW, the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, being a vice chair, and obviously one of the, 72 parties, I think, 73. Article 12 requires states parties to actively encourage other countries to join the treaty. And I think New Zealand and Costa Rica and Austria and Ireland, and actually quite a number of countries, ASEAN countries too, could form a group where you pick up on encouraging states parties to join, and it's based on, actually, Helen, you're very much involved as a member with the elders, and you have your agenda for nuclear minimization with its 4 doctrines. That can be seen as part of it. And a very closely related bit, which would come as a surprise, the Rajiv Gandhi plan, which was a 10-year time frame for the elimination of nuclear weapons. He articulated it in UNSOD 3, which was the 3rd special session on disarmament back in 1988. And Kate and I were there for that. That Gandhi plan, can you believe that India, a nuclear power, as recently as I think it was 2014 or 15, reiterated support for that plan. So you have a nuclear power which is not against an elimination. So New Zealand and the same number of countries under Article 12 of the Prohibition Treaty could develop with the elders a 10-year time frame. And it was a very good time frame plan. It had 3 phases, and it was going to run from 2000 to 2010, and you would eliminate the nuclear weapons. Now, they've come from 64,000 down to 12,000, and the elders say it should go to 2,000. But you can have an elimination plan as part of all this, in which there's a group promoting it as a implication of the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So those are 3 suggestions.
Well, very, very substantial suggestions too, Ken, and the last one would be interesting to talk about a bit more with respect to what the elders could do. You briefly touched on AUKUS, and Kevin, I know you're doing a lot of work on this at the moment. Prima facie, I agree with Ken that Australian involvement potentially is a violation of the spirit of the Rarotonga Treaty. But if New Zealand were to sign up to another pillar of it, the same would apply, would it not?
Yes,
I would assume so, and I think it's really important that we say no to AUKUS in any pillar, in any form. AUKUS is clearly an offensive sort of posturing by the US, Australia, and Britain against China, and with America becoming increasingly more erratic, and it seems to have really, the threat of a future war with China, and from that posturing and from where the US is going, is very real. And of course, any war which involves the US and China very likely could become a nuclear war. It's unlikely it would ever stay just conventional, given what's at stake. And so, no, we should stay well clear of it. New Zealand is the safest country in the world. If you do a hemisphere based on Wellington as the North or South Pole and look at where the equator is, it doesn't include any of Asia, any of the North America, just touches the very bottom of South America, includes basically Australia Antarctica and the Indonesian archipelago. We are surrounded by the world's largest moat. We are militarily the safest country in the world, as you will know from the work you've done, Helen, etc. So that we should be talking about not being involved in any of these military alliances. We should have a genuinely independent foreign policy and military, defence policy. And it should be about defence. If we're going to have any sort of military at all, we should be looking at a porcupine New Zealand, which is purely about what it would take to defend our shores. Not to have any ability to project offensive power anywhere, and that was things like getting rid of our strike air force, etc. And so AUKUS is a real danger. Signing up to Pillar 2 and thinking somehow it's going to help our industry base by, we're going to get access to AI and other technologies. It's a nonsense. The costs to the economy of hitching yourself to military development and spending is enormous. We're much better off if we're going to invest in our economy doing it in other ways.